Do not believe the conclusions of the Warren Report that Oswald either did it or acted alone. So I said to him, well, Mr. Garrison, if so many people believe that, why aren't they storming the barricades in Washington? And he said, well, you didn't see the second question. And I said, well, what was the second question? And the second question to the public was, would you like to see a deeper second investigation in which both the CIA and the FBI are questioned? And I said, and yes. He said, the percentage of people who wanted that was only 21%. Now, what do you think that tells us about Americans? And this is where the title came from. I said, Mr. Garrison, you know what it says to me immediately? I know what my mother and father did in the rumble seat of the car, or on the pool table, or in the beer hall, or in the bedroom to conceive me. But don't ever tell me my mother's not a virgin. Well, he howled. And he said, that sounds like my favorite quote from my favorite writer, who happens to be Mark Twain, that it's easier to fool people than to convince them they have been fooled. And, John, we have been fooled since November 22nd, 1963. So that's how the title of the book came about.
Yeah, but, John, let me ask you this. Why do you think it is that the American people, at that time at least, didn't want a larger, broader investigation?
Because you know what? It's true. We look upon our government as a parental figure. I mean, we look upon our church leaders. We look upon all our leaders as some kind of leaders and parental figures, and we hate to question them. My third favorite writer is Ben Hecht, and that's who I styled my book after. There are no chapters in my book. It's written as though it's a compilation of newspaper columns. So, for example, you don't have a guy named Donald Jeffries, a very successful writer, wrote the foreword to my book, and he said, the best book written in the English language is David Copperfield. John Barbour's book is David Copperfield Goes to Hollywood. But it's an unbelievable Canadian rags to American riches story. But, Ed, you don't have to go to page 1 and start and go to the last page because, for example, you know that I was the first person gonged off of the Gong Show.
That's right.
I was the first Gong Show host. So if you wanted to, you just go to the 5 or 6 pages where I tell that story, and you can read it. And you can do that with everything. On my encounters with Muhammad Ali and one of the worst human beings I ever met in television, Johnny Carson, anybody you name. For example, Red Fox was my mentor. And that's unbelievable for this white guy in the country illegally who decides to become a stand-up comic, and his hero and mentor becomes Red Fox. And when I got my first variety show, I was the first one to put Red Fox on television, and it led to Sanford and Son. That's his real name, John Sanford. And he called himself Fred on Sanford and Son because his idol was his older brother, Fred, who died and never got to see Red's success. All these great stories exist by themselves in the book. So tell your dad, you know, you made my day, as Clint Eastwood would say in Dirty Harry. You made my day telling me that your father won't give you the book back.
Yeah, I can't get it back. I don't want to admit that. But I don't know if you told me the story about Johnny Carson. Why was he such a bad guy?
Well, I don't want to go into it too long. But Johnny Carson never booked anybody on his show who didn't prove to be a success somewhere else, and he didn't have that kind of courage, the kind of courage that Jack Paar had. Jack Paar, Jack Paar was my idol, and Ed Murrow was my idol. They are the two reasons that I got into television. And I was very successful as a stand-up comic on Merv Griffin's show. And Carson saw me on that show and decided to book me on his show. And guess the date he booked me?
Can't imagine.
June the 8th, 1968. You know what day that is?
No, what's this? Your birthday?
No,
what?
The day Robert Kennedy died.
Oh, my God. Oh, you're kidding. Okay.
Yeah. So I told him, you can't do a show. They just murdered the next president of the United States. He said, if you don't do it, you'll never do the show again.
Really?
And that was the worst decision I ever made in my life. Johnny Carson was the most insecure, selfish drunk I ever met, but he did do a good monologue at the opening of his show, and he was wonderful when he interviewed celebrities. He was absolutely, totally incapable of interviewing anybody intellectual. So, and and the story of how, there's a great story in the book about when I was Frank Sinatra's private writer, and Carson and Francis knew that I was having this trouble all the time with Carson. Carson tried to get me fired a lot when I was, because we were both on the same network. I was only local and I had no contract. And in spite of his power, he could never get rid of me. Even Bob Hope wanted to get rid of me, and Jerry Lewis. I never had a contract. They fired me 3 times, but brought me back the next day because of popular demand. But anyway, Sinatra books me on The Tonight Show. And that is one of the really fantastic stories in the book. The book is just filled with them. I mean, when I bombed Bob Hope, I grew up adoring Bob Hope. I can remember when I was in Canada listening to Lorne Greene on the radio. Lorne Greene do you remember Lorne Greene?
Yes, I do. Bonanza, right?
Yeah, he was.
Sure.
He had this Orson Welles voice, and he was the voice of Canada, and he would come on the radio and tell stories. That's why I fell in love with storytellers. I spent most of my time either in the movie theater or the library when I wasn't in jail. I found the library because it was right across from the jail when they would release me. I'd get into the library. So I fell in love with becoming a storyteller, and years later, he came to the United States and became Ben Cartwright on Bonanza. But with Bob Hope, I remember he had a show for Pepsodent on radio. I could even remember the first time he was censored on radio. Anyway, he was in his 60s. I was a critic at NBC, and he was doing a special. And it was just god-awful. I mean, you could see him reading from the idiot cards. He wasn't funny. He was sloppy. It was an absolute and total embarrassment. And so I went on the air, and my review basically was this, that in America, when you reach a certain age at General Motors or at the phone company, if you get into your 60s, they make you retire. And the same should hold true for entertainers like Bob Hope, who, and I mentioned his age, and that he was becoming the J. Edgar Hoover of humor. Well, he was the king at NBC. And I got a call from Bob Howard, who was the general manager. And Bob Howard saved my life 3 times as a critic. Great stories in the book. And anyway, he called me and he said, will you take a phone call from Bob Hope's lawyer? And I said, sure, I'll take a call from anybody. So the phone rings and I pick it up and I say, hello. And the voice says, hey, kid, this is Bob Hope. It wasn't the lawyer. And I said, oh, God. And he said, you're damn right. So I started to laugh. And then he said, what did I ever do to you, kid? He called me kid, and I'm in my 40s, so I was offended. And I yelled back, and I said, you bored me. Didn't you see my review? And then there was this long pause. And he said, I did. And I said, Mr. Hope, you have to go back and re-look at the review. You have to remember all the magnificent things I said about you. I grew up to you. This is Bob broadcasting from Fort Ord Hope. I said I watched everyone. I listened to every one of your radio shows, watch your television shows, and your road pictures with Bing Crosby are absolute classics. The best movie you ever made was the one that you made with Lucille Ball, a wonderful film which deserved an Oscar. And I said, so I must tell you, you literally broke my heart by doing what it is that you did so badly. He ended up talking to me for an hour about his life. And you know what he talked about? He talked about money. The reason he talked about money, as I said to him, I said, listen, you've become one of the most famous entertainers in the world and by far the one of the richest. And he said, well, hold it, John. So now he's not calling me Kid anymore. He's calling me John. He said, Time magazine said I'm worth $500 million. He said, I am not. He said, let me tell you something, John. You think I'm smart? I'm not as smart as you think I am. I remember every joke I ever uttered, though. I will say that, which is true, because he recited some of his first jokes when he became a comic. So anyway, he says to me, I thought vaudeville would last. It didn't last. I thought radio would last. It didn't last. I thought television was going to last, and it's not going to last. Movies aren't going to last. And I said, well, what's going to last? He said, John, the only thing that lasts is the property that they're built on. He says, in the 50s, people, he said, you have this wonderful story about Ernie Kovacs. He said, we used to have to pay 90% in income tax. And he said, that was just serious. 90% of all our salaries for Bing and me and Kovacs and the rest of us went to the government. And I said, I'm not going to pay the government that much money. So what I did is I bought land. And when I bought land and then resold it, I was not penalized by the IRS nearly as much. I got to keep most of the money. And he said, so when I renegotiated my contracts with NBC, I didn't want an increase in my salary. I wanted to buy my land. And he said, and John, you're sitting on land owned by yours truly. I own most of the valley.
Yeah.
And that's how I got rich, and it was all by accident. And I said to him, Mr. Hope, that is such an interesting story. I have a live show, aside from being a critic over here, as you know, over on Channel 13 for a half hour every night at 7 o'clock, Monday through Friday. Would you come on and do the show? And he came on and did the show. And I would suggest to you that you or your audience go to my site, which is www.johnbarbersworld.com, and Google the Bob Hope's Christmas Show with John Barbour. It was by far, he said it publicly, the best interview that he ever did in his life. It was serious and it was funny. And guess who one of the people who called in live was? Bing Crosby.
Wow.
It is just phenomenal. So I would, and not only can you find this stuff at my site, but you'll find it in the book. And the subtitle of the book is The Bumpy Life and Times of the Canadian Dropout Who Changed the Face of American Television.
And John, are you still producing that podcast?
No, I stopped doing it about a year ago because when I published the book, Ed, I wanted to travel around the country, and I thought I was going to make it a bestseller in Canada because it would be, Prodigal Son Returns after changing the face of American television. And last April, I was scheduled for major media up there for book sellings at their biggest bookstores up there, which are not Barnes & Noble. And 1 week before I was to go, COVID hit, and they closed the borders. So I didn't get a chance to do it. But I didn't want to go back to doing the podcast because I'm having too much fun enjoying putting together YouTubes and Facebook posts, which are very successful. I don't get paid for them, but I just love doing it. And the one that I would suggest you watch for will be up Sunday night, and it's called The 10.5 Worst American Presidents. And I must tell you that as much as I did not like Donald Trump, I had a very hard time getting him stuffed in there as number 10. So there you go. It's going to be fabulous.
Let me ask you a quick question, because then we have to take a commercial break. Because you mentioned Bob Hope. And believe it or not, before you brought him up, I had written his name down on the pad I was going to ask you about. Because recently, Mamie Van Duren, okay? Are you familiar with her?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Are you familiar with her Facebook page? Because she's been making some revelations about Bob Hope, saying that he hit on her when she was 16 years old and she turned him down, and then he ruined her career. Do you know anything?
Listen, let me tell you something. Bob Hope,